Night fell slowly over the small town in the American Midwest, as if afraid to touch the ground. The sky took on a heavy, leaden hue, and the cold wind swept across the main street, carrying with it dust, dry leaves, and the distant echo of a life that insisted on continuing its course. The old shop facades, marked by time and neglect, reflected a weak light from the streetlights, creating long shadows that seemed to move on their own. It was an ordinary, predictable town where almost nothing happened. And yet that night, there was something different in the air. A dense, almost suffocating silence, like the instant before an explosion. Leaning against the worn brick wall of a shop that had been closed for years, a man stood still. He wasn't begging, he wasn't talking to anyone. He was simply there, as if part of the forgotten landscape. He wore an old coat, worn at the elbows, boots marked by miles of road, and a cap pulled down too low, partially hiding his face. To those passing by in a hurry, he was nothing more than a poor fellow, a visible failure, an uncomfortable reminder of everything that city pretended didn't exist. Some laughed as he passed. Others whispered quick comments, judgments too easy for those who had never carried the weight of a lifetime on their shoulders. No one asked his name. No one imagined his story. To them, that man was nothing more than someone who had lost his way. But what no one there knew, what no one even suspected, was that that man had survived wars. He wasn't just another forgotten person. He was a war veteran. His name was Bruce. Bruce kept his gaze fixed on some distant point, beyond the streetlights, beyond the city itself. His eyes weren't empty. They were tired. Tired of remembering, tired of forgetting, tired of being judged by those who would never set foot where he had been. The surrounding silence seemed to speak to him, bringing back memories that never left him in peace. The distant creak of a door closing sounded, for a brief second, like a gunshot. The sound of a car accelerating made his body stiffen almost imperceptibly. Ancient reflexes, training, etched into his soul. Bruce breathed slowly and steadily. It was a habit he'd learned on the battlefield, where breathing incorrectly meant death. Even there, on that seemingly harmless street, his body never forgot that the world could turn to chaos in the blink of an eye. A war veteran is never truly at peace. Even when everything seems calm, the city remained indifferent. A group of young people crossed the street, laughing loudly, clean clothes, cell phones in hand. One of them discreetly pointed at Bruce, murmured something, eliciting laughter from the others. Bruce heard. He always heard. But he didn't react. He had already learned that responding to contempt only fueled ignorance. Still, each laugh pierced his chest like a cruel reminder. He had served his country, risked his life for people who would never know his name. The wind picked up, making his thin coat flap against his body. The cold was nothing new to Bruce. He knew much worse cold that came from endless nights in distant deserts, from dawns where fear was his only companion. Yet this cold had a different meaning. It was the cold of exclusion, the cold of no longer belonging anywhere. The streetlights flickered, threatening to go out. The distant sound of a bell marked the hour, perhaps coming from the old town church, perhaps just from his memory. Bruce closed his eyes for a moment. When he did, the present mingled with the past in a dangerous way. He saw faces that were no longer there. He heard voices that would never answer again. He felt the weight of responsibility, of decisions made in seconds that changed lives forever. He was a war veteran, and that would never cease to define him, even if the world insisted on ignoring it. When he opened his eyes again, there was something different in his gaze. It wasn't anger, it wasn't hatred. It was something deeper, a quiet awareness that surviving wasn't the same as living. Bruce knew this better than anyone. He had returned from the war with his body intact, but had left parts of himself scattered along the way. Parts that this city would never understand. A car slowed down as it passed him. The driver glanced quickly, assessing, judging, and continued on. For Bruce, this was nothing new. Invisibility had become routine. Still, deep down, something stirred. An old premonition, the same one that precedes danger. Bruce felt, with the clarity that only a war veteran possesses, that this night would not end like the others. He slowly moved away from the wall, taking a step forward. The sound of his boots on the asphalt echoed low, steady, laden with meaning. It wasn't just a physical movement, it was the beginning of something. The wind stirred up dust and leaves, swirling around him as if the world were finally paying attention. They laughed at the poor man. They laughed at the forgotten man. But that night, in that small town in the American Midwest, destiny began to move. And silently, without applause, without recognition, Bruce, the war veteran, was about to prove that some stories cannot be judged by appearances, and that a man's past can completely transform the future of everyone around him. Bruce took a deep breath, as if he knew that each step from then on would carry a greater meaning than it seemed. Stories like his are rarely told in their entirety, and when they are, it depends on who decides to listen to them to the end. If this beginning has already awakened something in you, it's because a silent connection is happening now. Staying with this journey is a way to give voice to those who have spent their lives being ignored. A simple sign of support helps these stories by liking them and allowing them to continue reaching more people. Nothing is required, just a discreet gesture of recognition. Subscribe to the channel, and if you decide to stay here, you won't just be watching. You'll be a part of this story. The day always dawned the same way for Bruce. Even before the sun fully broke through the horizon, he was already awake, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed in a small rented room above an old mechanic's workshop. The place smelled of old oil and damp wood, and the creaking of the floor betrayed every movement, as if the house itself were tired of existing. For Bruce, however, that sound was almost comforting. Predictable noises, unlike the unpredictable sounds that still visited him during sleep. Sleep was never deep. The war veteran rarely went through an entire night without waking at least once, his heart racing and his breath short. Sometimes it was a confused dream. Other times just a sudden feeling of danger, as if someone were about to burst into the room. He would remain motionless for a few seconds, assessing his surroundings, mentally counting the exits, acknowledging the present, a silent ritual that repeated itself every day. Only then would he get up. Bruce's routine was simple, almost invisible. He made weak coffee in an old coffee maker, always the same chipped mug, always the same silence. He sat near the small window, watching the street slowly come alive. People going to work, cars passing by, children waiting for the school bus. A city that moved on without noticing that a war veteran was observing everything from above, like a displaced spectator in the very country he had served. He left early, not because he had important appointments, but because standing still for too long bothered him. Walking helped keep his thoughts under control. His worn boots pounded the asphalt in a steady rhythm, almost like an unconscious march. Bruce knew every street, every shortcut, every corner of that small town. He also knew the stairs. Some avoided him. Others carried curiosity mixed with disdain. Few said good morning. At the small corner market, the clerk, Ashley, he greeted him with a discreet nod. It wasn't exaggerated friendliness nor coldness, just silent respect. Bruce returned the gesture with a slight nod. He always bought the basics: bread, canned goods, cheap coffee. He never complained about prices, never struck up a conversation. He paid in cash, counting the bills with almost obsessive precision, a discipline that doesn't disappear when the war ends. The neighbors knew little about him. Some believed he was a man who hadn't made it in life. Others said he had problems. Few suspected that Bruce was a war veteran. He never wore medals, never mentioned his past, never corrected his wrong judgments. Part of him believed that explaining wouldn't change anything. Another part was simply too tired to try. In the afternoon, Bruce would usually sit on a bench away from the central square. He would observe the people, the birds, the slow movement of the city. He kept his hands resting on his knees, his posture erect, his gaze attentive. Even at rest, he was alert. His body remembered what his mind tried to forget. A war veteran never stops scanning his surroundings, never stops calculating risks, even when there is no threat at all. There were days when he accepted small temporary jobs, carrying boxes, clearing land, repairing fences, always physical tasks, always solitary. Bruce preferred it that way, The effort kept his thoughts occupied. Physical fatigue was easier to deal with than mental fatigue. Some people hired him out of pity, others out of necessity. None imagined that this silent man had already led people under extreme pressure, had already made decisions that cost lives, including his own, in a way. Loneliness was constant, but it wasn't exactly new. Bruce had learned, while still in the military, that trusting too much could be dangerous. After the war, this intensified. He avoided deep connections, avoided questions, avoided anything that might make him relive what he had buried deep inside. The city felt this invisible barrier, and, in response, it kept its distance. At night, Bruce would return to the room above the workshop. The sunset painted the sky orange and red, colors that sometimes made him uneasy without him knowing why. He would prepare a simple meal, sit in silence, and listen to the radio softly, almost imperceptibly. News, old songs, distant voices. Everything seemed to belong to another life. There were times when Bruce would stare at his reflection in the small mirror in his room. He saw a man aged before his time, with broad shoulders still firm, but eyes heavy with untold stories. A war veteran forgotten by the city he had sworn to protect. He wondered, silently, if it had all been worth it. He wasn't looking for answers. He simply endured the question. Despite everything, there was something that still kept him going. A kind of internal code. A sense of responsibility that refused to die. Bruce might be isolated, discredited, treated like nobody, but he was still a war veteran. And even in the simple, invisible, and harsh life of that small town, something inside him remained on alert, as if it knew that this fragile routine was about to be broken. Long before he was seen as a broken man, long before he bore the invisible marks of combat on his body and soul, Bruce, he was just an ordinary boy, raised in a small town in the American Midwest, where the streets were too quiet to prepare anyone for the chaos of the real world. Back then, life seemed to follow a predictable, almost gentle rhythm. The mornings smelled of fresh coffee, the afternoons were marked by the distant sound of lawnmowers, and the nights brought the comfortable silence of those who believed that tomorrow would always arrive just like today. Bruce grew up in a simple but solid home, built more on values than on comfort. His father, Thomas, he was a man of few words, with calloused hands and a firm posture. He worked hard every day and believed that a man's character was defined by the choices he made when no one was watching. Thomas didn't talk about emotions, but he showed love in small gestures. Fixing something broken, waking up early to ensure nothing was missing, remaining silent beside his son when words weren't enough. Your mother, she was the balance of that house. She had a gentle yet strong presence, an attentive gaze capable of perceiving Bruce's anxieties even before he understood what he felt. It was Mila who taught him empathy, who showed him that strength didn't mean harshness, and that caring for others was also a form of courage. Bruce learned early on that responsibility wasn't a burden, but a daily choice. In his childhood, Bruce didn't stand out for drawing attention. He observed more than he spoke. He preferred to stay alone in the backyard, taking apart old objects, trying to understand how they worked, patiently rebuilding them. There was a quiet curiosity in him, and an almost instinctive need to understand the world around him. While others dreamed of fame or money, Bruce dreamed of purpose, although he didn't yet know how to name it. At school he was respected, not because he was popular, but because he was fair. When he saw someone being humiliated, he felt a deep, almost physical discomfort. He didn't seek conflict, but he also didn't walk away when he saw an injustice happening. This sense of protection, still naive, began to shape his identity long before he wore any uniform. Over the years, the world began to infiltrate that quiet town through television, radio, and whispered conversations between adults. The news spoke of distant wars, of soldiers sent to places that seemed unreal to those who had never left their own state. For many, they were just headlines. For Bruce, they were questions. What did it mean to serve? What made a man truly useful? While some friends considered leaving town to seek better jobs or a more comfortable life, Bruce felt a different calling. It wasn't ambition, it was duty. He saw military service as a way to be part of something bigger than himself. The idea of discipline, brotherhood, and mission resonated deeply with everything he had learned at home. It was during this period that Scarlett, she entered his life. She was different from the other people Bruce knew. She had an attentive, almost intuitive way of perceiving what he felt, even when he said nothing. They talked for hours, walking along empty roads, talking about possibilities, about who they could become. Scarlett believed in Bruce in a way that both frightened and comforted him. For the first time, he seriously considered a future that included staying, building something, putting down roots. But the calling didn't disappear. On the contrary, it grew stronger. Bruce felt torn between what he wanted for himself and what he believed to be his duty. At the dinner table, he watched Thomas in silence, noticing in his father's eyes that he understood that conflict better than he let on. Mila, for her part, tried to savor every moment, as if she knew that time was running out. The decision to enlist didn't come during a dramatic moment. It came on an ordinary, almost banal morning. Bruce woke up early, sat with his parents, and spoke in a firm yet restrained voice. He didn't ask permission. He communicated a choice. Mila held back tears, disguising her fear behind practical advice. Thomas placed his hand firmly on the table, as if acknowledging that some decisions cannot be avoided. Before leaving, Bruce tried to memorize every detail of the life he was leaving behind. The sound of the creaking door, the smell of the house, the feeling of security that only childhood offers. He sincerely believed he would return the same. He believed that war was something external, something that wouldn't penetrate his essence. He didn't know that some experiences not only change a man, they completely redefine him. When he left the city, looking out the bus window, Bruce was still whole. He still believed in simple promises, in happy returns, in predictable endings. He didn't leave in search of glory. He left believing that serving was the right thing to do. And it was precisely this conviction, pure and honest, that led him down a path of no return. The path that would transform that quiet young man into a war veteran forever marked. The war did not begin for Bruce with gunshots or explosions. It began in the heavy silence of the first boarding, in the gaze of the men around him trying to appear confident, in the tightness in his chest that arose without clear explanation. When the plane landed on foreign soil, he felt for the first time that he had crossed an invisible border. Not just geographical, but emotional. From then on, everything he knew about fear, control, and humanity would be rewritten. In the early days, Bruce still carried the naivete of someone who believes training is enough. The uniform seemed too big, the equipment too heavy, and the environment too hostile for any romantic notion of heroism. The extreme heat during the day contrasted with the biting cold of the night, and his body never found complete rest. Even so, he followed orders with precision, absorbing every detail, every rule, every protocol. A war veteran is born first from discipline, even before pain. It was during the first patrols that reality began to set in. The absolute silence of certain areas was more terrifying than any noise. Bruce quickly learned that danger rarely announced its arrival. It came in fractions of a second, in decisions that needed to be made without time to hesitate. Every corner, every door, every shadow could hide something irreversible. The constant tension gnawed at his nerves, even when nothing was happening. The men around Bruce became his new family, not out of affection, but out of necessity. There they were. Oliver, always trying to lighten the mood with dry humor. Thomas, a namesake of his father, which made him strangely comfortable. Serious, methodical, reliable, and others whose names mingled with the sound of the wind and shouted orders. They shared everything: water, silence, fear. They also shared the certainty that if something went wrong, they would depend on each other to return alive. The first, truly traumatic moment wasn't the most violent, but the most confusing. A misinterpreted order, a sudden movement, a noise that no one could identify in time. Bruce remembers the sensation of time slowing down, his heart beating so hard it felt like it wanted to burst out of his chest. Then screams, not from enemies, but from comrades. When it was all over, there was a strange emptiness in the air, a feeling that something had been broken forever. Bruce didn't cry. Not at that moment. He simply did what needed to be done. He helped as best he could. He followed protocols. He kept every emotion locked away in a place too deep to be easily accessed. It was there that he began to understand that war demands not only physical strength, but the brutal ability to keep functioning when the soul begs to stop. The losses came gradually, like successive blows that didn't allow time to heal. A face that no longer appeared in the formation. An empty place at the makeshift table. A joke that would never be repeated. Each absence left a silent mark. Bruce began to carry names in his memory as if they were invisible weights. He remembered the small details, the way they spoke, their habits, the promises made to return home. The nights were the worst. When his body finally stopped, his mind refused to rest. Distant sounds transformed into imagined threats. The darkness brought back memories that the day had kept at bay. Bruce learned to sleep in fragments, always alert, always ready. Even when nothing happened, the fear remained. A war veteran learns that danger doesn't end when the noise stops. There was one particular episode that never left Bruce's mind. An operation that should have been simple, a miscalculation, a minor delay that proved costly. He remembers the look in her eyes. Oliver, from the attempt to say something that never quite formed into words. Remember the crushing weight of powerlessness. There was no time for heroism, only survival. And surviving at that moment felt like a betrayal. After that, something changed definitively. Bruce continued to perform his duties, remained efficient, reliable, and disciplined. But inside, he began to shut down. He created emotional barriers that protected him from immediate pain, but which would exact a high price later. He stopped imagining the future. He began to live only for the next minute, the next order, the next step. When his service ended and the possibility of returning home became real, Bruce didn't feel immediate relief. He felt a sense of estrangement. War had become his point of reference for normalcy. Chaos had clear rules. Civilian life did not. He carried memories that couldn't be explained in simple words. How could he tell someone that certain images never disappear? That certain sounds become forever etched in the mind? Bruce returned with his body intact, but with invisible scars that no one saw. He was officially a war veteran, but he didn't feel like a victorious survivor. She felt like someone who had left essential parts of herself scattered in places she would never visit again. The war had ended on the calendar, but it continued to happen inside him, and it was there, without fully realizing it, that Bruce began to fight the most difficult battle of all. The one that no uniform protects, no training prepares, and no visible enemy confronts. The war that would accompany him forever. For a long time, Bruce, he believed that nothing else could break the silent routine he had built for himself. The days repeated themselves with almost mechanical precision, as if each step had been calculated to avoid any surprises. For a war veteran, predictability was a form of survival. He had learned, in the hardest way possible, that unexpected events usually exacted too high a price. Still, fate rarely respects the walls a man builds around himself. That morning, the city awoke differently, though few noticed. The sky was low, heavy with grey clouds, and the air had an unsettling weight, as if announcing something no one wanted to name. Bruce was walking down the main street when he noticed unusual activity in front of the small local bank. 2 cars were carelessly parked. People were huddled together in the distance. Nervous whispers filled the air. He slowed his pace, not out of ordinary curiosity, but instinct. A war veteran recognizes disorder even before understanding its origin. Bruce tried to move on. He told himself it wasn't his problem anymore. He'd already paid his fair share. But something stopped him. A muffled scream echoed from inside the building, not loud, not dramatic, but laden with contained panic. That sound pierced Bruce like an invisible bullet. His body reacted before his mind, shoulders tense, breathing controlled, eyes alert. People around whispered. No one seemed truly willing to approach. There was fear, but also indifference. Bruce heard someone say it was just confusion, that it would soon be over. That word, confusion, brought back a bitter memory. In war, everything that began as confusion ended in tragedy. It was then that Bruce recognized a face in the crowd. Ashley, the market attendant. She was pale, her hands trembling, staring intently at the bank entrance. Beside her, an older man, Oliver Bruce, the owner of a small workshop in town, was trying to calm her down, but clearly didn't know how. Bruce moved close enough to hear Ashley, her voice almost broken, whisper that Scarlett, her childhood friend, was inside, trapped, scared, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. The name hit Bruce with unexpected force. Scarlett, someone who was part of a life he thought he had left behind. For a moment, he felt the temptation to walk away, to pretend he hadn't heard, to hide again behind the anonymity he had cultivated with so much effort. He owed nothing to that city. He owed nothing to anyone. That's what he had been repeating to himself for years. But the truth was crueler. He owed it to himself. While they awaited reinforcements that seemed to be taking too long, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. One mistake, one wrong move, and everything could spiral out of control. Bruce observed every detail: the doors, the windows, the blind spots. Without realizing it, he was already analyzing the situation, as he had done hundreds of times in the past. That part of him had never gone away. It was just dormant. Ashley noticed Bruce's gaze. For the first time, she truly saw him. Not as the silent man who bought cheap coffee, but as someone who understood exactly what was happening. She approached him cautiously, as if afraid of frightening him. She said in a low voice that no one seemed to know what to do. Then everyone was afraid to act. Bruce felt the weight of that expectation fall on his shoulders. It wasn't an explicit request. It was worse. It was the silent hope of someone who sees no other way out. A war veteran knows this kind of look well. He's seen it many times in situations where retreating wasn't an option. He closed his eyes for a brief moment. The memories came rushing back. Voices, orders, promises made to men who never returned. Bruce knew that if he took a step forward, there would be no easy return. That gesture could expose who he really was. It could bring to the surface everything he had spent years trying to bury. But he also knew that ignoring that call would mean carrying yet another unbearable weight. When he opened his eyes, the decision had already been made. Bruce walked toward the makeshift police tape. One of the officers tried to stop him, asking him to step aside. Bruce didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply said, calmly and firmly, that he needed to help. There was something in his posture, in his tone, that made the officer hesitate for a second longer than usual, a decisive second. At that moment, Bruce ceased to be just the forgotten man of the city. He stopped being the ridiculed poor guy. He became once again what he had always been, even without his uniform. A war veteran called to action when everyone else retreated. The event that would break his routine wasn't his choice. It was imposed upon him. And by accepting this silent calling, Bruce crossed yet another invisible line. The line that separates the observer from the one who takes responsibility. From that point on, nothing would ever be simple again. Bruce remained motionless for a few seconds after taking his first step forward, as if testing his own body, making sure it still responded to his mind's commands. The world around him seemed to slow down. The murmur of the crowd became distant, almost irrelevant. For everyone there, it was a moment of collective panic. For him, it was a scene all too familiar. A war veteran recognizes chaos not by the noise, but by the tension in the air, by the way people breathe, by the barely disguised fear in their eyes. He didn't advance with bravado or heroic gestures. He moved cautiously, assessing every detail, every movement. He observed the bank's main door, the side windows, the reflection in the glass that allowed him to see only fragments of the interior. He quickly realized that whoever was inside didn't seem like a cold and calculating criminal, but someone cornered, desperate, reacting more out of fear than out of a real intention to hurt. This assessment didn't come from common intuition, but from years of dealing with men pushed to their limits. Bruce took a deep breath and felt the weight of the decision settle in his chest. He could simply walk away. No one there truly knew him. No one would demand explanations. But the war veteran knew that courage is not always about facing danger head-on. Sometimes it's about not turning away when everyone else is watching. He asked permission to get closer to the entrance. He spoke in a low, controlled voice, without being authoritarian. The officer ahead hesitated, but something in Bruce's tone, firm without being aggressive, conveyed confidence. It was the kind of voice that didn't ask, but also didn't threaten. After a few tense seconds, he was allowed to get closer, on the condition that he keep his hands visible and follow instructions. Bruce obeyed. He always knew that discipline opens doors that brute force never could. A few meters from the entrance, he spoke. He didn't shout. He didn't make demands. He simply announced his presence, saying he was there to help, that no one needed to get hurt. His words were simple, human. He chose each phrase carefully, like someone treading on unstable ground. The silence that followed was heavy, almost unbearable. Then, a voice answered from inside, trembling, heavy with fear. Bruce listened attentively. He didn't interrupt. He didn't judge. He let the person speak, let out the despair that had accumulated up to that point. A war veteran understands that often, listening is the first way to save a life. While the voice spoke, Bruce analyzed the rhythm of the breathing, the pauses, the changes in tone. Everything indicated someone on the verge of an emotional breakdown. He introduced himself simply as Bruce. He didn't mention his past. He didn't cite the war. That didn't matter there. What mattered was creating a thread of trust amidst the chaos. Bruce spoke about choices, about how decisions made in desperation tend to leave deeper scars than the problem itself. He spoke as someone who had already lived through irreversible consequences. Within himself, however, the conflict was intense. Each word, each step, reopened doors he had kept closed for years. Memories of the battlefield insisted on resurfacing. Negotiations conducted under pressure, voices broken by fear, seconds that defined entire lives. He felt his hands trembling slightly, but he maintained control. Not from an absence of fear, but from experience in acting, despite it. At a certain point, Bruce saw an opportunity, a slight adjustment of position, a moment when the tension lessened even slightly. He moved a few centimeters closer, always signaling each movement. Transparency was essential. Any surprise could ruin everything. He continued talking, now about responsibility, not as a demand, but as a possibility for redemption. He said there was still a way out, that no one there needed to carry that weight for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, outside, Ashley watched silently, her heart racing. For the first time, she understood that this unassuming man, ignored by so many, possessed a different kind of presence. It wasn't arrogance, it was solidity. Oliver, beside her, murmured that Bruce seemed like someone who had been in far worse situations. They didn't know it yet, but they were witnessing a war veteran putting everything he had learned into practice. Not to destroy, but to protect. The most delicate moment came when the voice inside began to falter, threatening to turn into absolute panic. Bruce immediately recognized the danger. He lowered his voice even further, almost a whisper, and spoke about breathing, about slowing down, about thinking only about the next second. This simple technique, learned amidst the chaos of war, was often the difference between life and death. The minutes dragged on. Each second felt like an eternity. Bruce felt the sweat trickling down his back despite the cold. He knew there was no guarantee of success. Still, he continued. Not out of heroism, but out of humanity. He didn't see an enemy there. He saw someone lost, like so many he had seen before. When the tension finally began to ease, Bruce felt an enormous weight lift from his chest. It wasn't complete relief, that never came easily, but the certainty that he had done the right thing. By helping to prevent that situation from ending in tragedy, he was also silently confronting his own ghosts. In that act of courage, Bruce not only saved lives, he proved to himself that he was still capable of using everything the war had taught him for something other than destruction. A war veteran may carry trauma forever, but he also carries skills, humanity, and the ability to make a difference when it matters most. And in that instant, in front of that simple bench in a forgotten city, Bruce ceased to be merely a survivor. He became someone who chooses to act again. When the first sign of control seemed to emerge, Bruce felt something he knew all too well, the false sense of stability. In war, the most dangerous moments almost always came right after the impression that everything was under control. He maintained a calm demeanor, but inside, every instinct remained on high alert. A war veteran learns to distrust silence that comes too soon. Outside, the crowd grew. People who had previously watched from a distance now drew closer, attracted by the collective tension and fear. Some whispered Bruce's name, trying to understand who this man was, who had taken to the front lines without a uniform, without official authority. Others simply watched, hoping it would all end quickly, without understanding that the hardest part was yet to come. Inside, the situation began to change unpredictably. The voice that had previously responded with short phrases began to oscillate between anger and despair. Bruce immediately noticed the change in pattern. Something had been said, remembered, or interpreted incorrectly. Perhaps a poorly chosen word, perhaps an intrusive thought. In situations like this, the human mind can become the greatest enemy. Bruce felt his heart race, not from fear of what might happen there, but from the recognition of something much deeper. That emotional turmoil was frighteningly similar to what he himself had felt. That thin line between reason and collapse. The war veteran wasn't just seeing an external crisis, he was seeing a mirror. Tension rose when a sudden movement was noticed through one of the side windows. A poorly positioned police officer had moved too close. Bruce noticed it before anyone else. His body reacted instantly, as it had so many times in conflict zones. He discreetly raised his hand, asking for calm, trying to prevent a chain reaction. But the damage was already done. The voice inside changed, filled with panic. Bruce needed to act fast. He spoke firmly, but without raising his voice, explaining that this wasn't part of the agreement, that no one was trying to deceive anyone. Each word was an attempt to rebuild a fragile trust on the verge of collapse. He felt cold sweat trickling down his temples. The past pressed down hard. Memories began to invade his mind uninvited. A poorly conducted operation, a hasty advance, a communication error that had cost too dearly. Bruce struggled to stay focused on the present, but the war insisted on infiltrating. The distant sound of a siren mingled in his head with memories of old alarms. For a second, time seemed to collapse. The biggest conflict wasn't just avoiding a tragedy there. It was preventing his own ghosts from taking control. Bruce felt the crushing weight of responsibility. If he failed, it wouldn't just be another mistake. It would be confirmation of everything he'd feared since returning from the war. That, at the decisive moment, he wouldn't be able to support anyone, not even himself. Ashley watched from a distance, sensing that something had changed. The atmosphere was no longer one of cautious hope, but of imminent danger. Oliver held her arm, trying to keep her steady. They both realized that Bruce was carrying something invisible, something too heavy to share. Yet, he remained there, motionless, facing a storm that no one else could see. Inside the bank, the desperation reached a new level. The voice spoke too fast, without pauses, mixing justifications, accusations, and regrets. Bruce recognized the signs. This wasn't just fear, it was collapse. A war veteran learns that in these moments, any attempt at external control needs to be minimal. The focus must be internal, human. He took another step closer, deliberately breaking the safe distance. It was a calculated risk. He knew that, at certain times, showing vulnerability is more effective than imposing authority. Bruce spoke about failures, about bad decisions, about carrying guilt that doesn't go away. Without going into detail, he made it clear that he understood the weight of making mistakes when there is no room for error. This controlled confession opened an unexpected breach. For a moment, the voice within hesitated. The rhythm changed. Silence returned. Not that threatening silence, but a silence of listening. Still, the danger had not passed. The greater conflict remained. Any slip could transform that fragile moment into disaster. Bruce felt his body grow weary, not physically, but emotionally. Maintaining that level of focus, empathy, and control took a heavy toll. He felt the familiar pain in his chest, the one that surfaced when the past pressed too hard. But he didn't back down. A war veteran knows that some battles demand everything that's left. As the situation teetered dangerously on the brink, Bruce understood something essential. This confrontation wasn't just about saving lives. It was about facing, once and for all, the part of himself he had been avoiding since leaving the battlefield. The real threat wasn't armed on the other side of the door, it was inside him. And at that critical moment, Bruce understood that if he wanted to win, he would need to go through this greater conflict without hiding, without armor, without running away. The external war had ended years ago. The internal one, however, was reaching its most decisive point. The moment that followed was too silent. Not ordinary silence, but the kind that weighs on your shoulders, that compresses your chest and makes every breath a conscious effort. Bruce felt the world around him narrow, as if everything, the crowd, the cars, the city itself, had receded to make way only for that invisible corridor between him and the bank door. A war veteran recognizes this moment with cruel clarity. The point where there is no more room for error, where any decision carries irreversible consequences. Bruce's body began to react before he could control it. A slight tremor ran through his hands. His heart was beating too fast, too hard. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, trying to anchor himself in the present. But it was precisely there that the past erupted violently. It didn't come in clear images, but in overwhelming sensations. The metallic smell in the air, the suffocating heat. The weight of a silence broken by screams that never left him. He found himself back on the battlefield, not as a distant memory, but as if it were happening again. The same miscalculation, the same slight hesitation that had cost him dearly. Bruce felt a lump form in his throat as the memory brought back a specific face. Someone who had trusted him, someone who had followed his orders. A face that vanished in an instant, a face Bruce had replayed in countless dreams, always trying to change the ending. The war veteran struggled to keep his eyes open. The present insisted on slipping away. The distant sound of a siren transformed in his mind into the shrill alarm that preceded chaos. He felt his legs weaken. For a terrible second, Bruce was certain he couldn't go on. That this battle, the last, the most cruel, would defeat him right there. Outside, Ashley noticed the change before anyone else. Bruce's expression had drastically altered. It was no longer just concentration. It was pain. Raw, exposed pain, difficult to hide. Oliver instinctively stepped forward as if he wanted to help. But there was nothing they could do. This fight wasn't being fought in physical space. It was happening entirely inside Bruce. Inside, the situation was also deteriorating. The voice, now almost unrecognizable, spoke between sobs and disjointed phrases. Despair had reached a breaking point. Bruce knew that if he lost control for even a moment, everything could end in the worst possible way. Yet his mind insisted on pulling him back, to places he had sworn never to revisit. That's when the collapse was complete. Bruce felt tears welling up without warning. Not silent, discreet tears, but the kind that come when a man has carried too much weight for too long. He didn't try to hide them. He had no strength left. There, in front of everyone, the war veteran finally broke. The pain he had carried for years found a crack and overflowed. He spoke. Not to negotiate, not to convince. He spoke because he needed to. With a faltering voice, he confessed that he knew what it was like to make a mistake when you can't afford to. That he knew what it was like to live with consequences that never disappear. He said he had spent years trying to survive his own past, waking up every night with the feeling that it was still there. That the war hadn't left him when he returned home. Each word came out like a piece torn from within. Bruce was no longer playing a controlling role. He was exposing his deepest wound. A war veteran, stripped of any mask, showing the world the true cost of survival. The effect was immediate and unexpected. The voice inside ceased completely. There was no response, only silence. But it was a different kind of silence, attentive, heavy, human. Bruce realized he had been heard, not as a negotiator, as someone who understood. For a moment, Bruce thought that perhaps he had gone too far, that this vulnerability could be interpreted as weakness. But the truth was different. By allowing himself to fall, he had created a space where the other could also stop fighting. Time seemed suspended. Bruce felt the cold air fill his lungs, Tears continued to fall, but his breathing gradually began to stabilize. He remained there, motionless, accepting the risk, accepting the pain, accepting finally that he didn't have to overcome everything alone. Inside the bank, the answer came in an almost inaudible whisper, a plea for help, not a strategic one, but a human one. Bruce felt the impact of that word like a gentle punch to the chest. Help. That was what he himself had never asked for. In that moment of utter rupture, Bruce understood something he had avoided for years. The war hadn't completely broken him. The silence had. The isolation had. And there, exposed, vulnerable, he was going through the most painful point of his journey. The war veteran didn't emerge stronger. He didn't become invincible. He simply remained, present, human. And paradoxically, that's precisely what prevented tragedy. That collapse was not the end. It was the beginning of the possibility of redemption, not just for the situation before him, but for the very life he had learned to endure, but never to heal. The silence that followed the plea for help was not empty. It was dense, heavy with expectation, like the suspended moment before an inevitable outcome. Bruce remained where he was, feeling his own heart resume a more controlled rhythm, even though each beat echoed as a reminder of how close everything had been to collapse. A war veteran learns that the climax of a battle rarely comes with noise. Sometimes it arrives in the form of stillness, demanding absolute emotional precision. Bruce answered with few words. He didn't promise miracles. He didn't offer easy solutions. He simply said that he would stay there, that no one needed to die that night, that there were paths that hadn't yet been tried. His voice was hoarse, marked by recent crying but firm. There was an honesty in it that couldn't be rehearsed. That wasn't technique. It was truth. Outside, the police waited, tense. Ashley held her hands together, as if in prayer. Oliver kept his eyes fixed on the door, realizing, even without fully understanding, that something decisive was happening. The entire city seemed to hold its breath. For the first time, no one laughed at the poor guy. No one dared judge him. Everyone was, in some way, dependent on that silent man. Inside, the person began to follow Bruce's simple instructions. Breathe slowly, sit down, move away anything that could cause harm. Each gesture was small, but each represented an immense victory against panic. Bruce guided without imposing, orienting without pressuring. That's how you lead someone out of the abyss, not by pushing, but by offering firm support. The memories of the war still haunted Bruce, but they no longer dominated his space. He acknowledged them, accepted their presence, and yet, he moved forward. That was true overcoming, acting despite the pain, despite the fear, despite the memories. A war veteran doesn't win by forgetting the past, but by preventing it from determining every step of the present. The decisive moment came when the door finally opened, slowly, creaking as if the building itself were reluctant to end the tension. The figure that emerged was not that of a villain, but of someone exhausted, broken, carrying more weight than they could bear. Bruce kept his distance, hands visible, posture open. There was no rush. There were no screams. Just a human encounter at the most vulnerable point possible. When it was all over, and the situation was officially under control, Bruce felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. His legs threatened to give way. He leaned discreetly against a post, breathing deeply, feeling the cold night air touch his sweaty skin. The climax had passed, but the emotional impact still reverberated powerfully. Ashley ran to him, tears in her eyes, thanking him in a low voice, as if loud words could break something sacred. Oliver approached soon after, placing his hand on Bruce's shoulder in a simple gesture, full of respect. There was no exaggerated applause. There was silent recognition, the kind that truly matters to someone who has lost so much. Bruce observed the movement around him with a distant gaze. He knew that night wouldn't erase his traumas. He knew he would still wake up with difficult memories, but he also knew something new. He wasn't condemned to be just an isolated survivor. He had overcome there not only an external crisis, but the belief that he was no longer good for anything. As the vehicles drove away and the crowd began to disperse, Bruce felt something rare. Not complete happiness, but momentary peace. The feeling of having done the right thing, even when everything inside him screamed to run. A war veteran doesn't choose when he will be tested again. But that night, Bruce had passed the most difficult test of all. And in facing his greatest fear, that of failing again, he discovered that he was still capable of protecting, of caring, of making a difference. The overcoming didn't come as a trophy. It came as a silent step out of the shadows. The following morning dawned slowly over the small inland town, as if the day itself needed caution so as not to disturb what had been mended during the night. Sunlight streamed through the narrow alleyways, reflected off the simple shop windows, and touched, with almost respectful delicacy, Bruce's tired face as he walked back home. A war veteran learns to recognize when something has changed, even if the world around him seems exactly the same. And something definitely had changed within him. Bruce opened the door to his humble home and was greeted by the same silence as always. The worn walls, the old sofa, the familiar smell of cold coffee still lingered in the air. Nothing there indicated heroism. Nothing reminded him of the previous night. Still, he sat down slowly, resting his elbows on his knees, and realized that the weight on his chest was no longer the same. It hadn't disappeared, but it no longer crushed him. That day, the city began to look at Bruce differently. There were no sensational headlines or official speeches. There were small, almost imperceptible gestures. A respectful wave at the market, a more sincere "good morning," a coffee silently paid for by the diner owner. For someone who had spent years being ignored or ridiculed, that said more than any medal. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't seen as the strange poor guy on the street. He was recognized as a war veteran who still carried value. Ashley arrived late in the afternoon, bringing a simple homemade pie. There were no long conversations. They sat on the porch, watching the slow movement of the street. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was grateful. Ashley didn't try to fix Bruce, didn't ask intrusive questions. She was simply there. And for a man who had learned in war that presence can mean survival, that was more powerful than words. Oliver also stopped by in the following days. In one of those meetings, he mentioned that he had decided to pursue a career in public service. He said that seeing Bruce act that night made him understand that courage has no appearance, no visible uniform. Bruce listened in silence, feeling a lump in his throat. A war veteran rarely imagines that he can still inspire someone. But there was living proof that his scars were not just marks of pain. They were sources of learning. Scarlett and Myla, who had previously barely exchanged glances with Bruce, began to treat him with almost attentive respect. Not out of pity, but out of recognition. The city gradually began to see that many of its judgments had been shallow, unfair, and hasty. Bruce didn't demand apologies. He knew that true change doesn't come from words, but from consistent actions. That night, alone again, Bruce revisited old memories. Not to torture himself, but to organize them. For the first time, he allowed himself to remember his fallen comrades without feeling only guilt. He felt longing, honor, and a sense of continuity. He had survived not by chance, but to carry something forward. A war veteran doesn't choose the weight he brings from the battlefield, but he can choose what to do with it. Bruce began quietly helping other veterans in the region, not as a formal leader, nor as a public example, just as someone who understood the silence, the long pauses, the distant gazes. Sometimes all he did was sit next to another broken man and share the silence. He knew better than anyone that this was already a lot. The laughter that once mocked him lost its power. Not because everyone had suddenly become better, but because the truth had prevailed. They laughed at the poor man until they discovered that he was a war veteran, and more than that, a whole, complex, resilient human being. The moral of that story wasn't about turning Bruce into an unattainable hero, but about remembering that no one is only what they appear to be. Bruce finally understood that healing isn't about erasing the past. Healing is about learning to walk with it without bleeding at every step. The war would never completely leave him, but it no longer defined his end. He still woke up early, still felt old pains, still had difficult nights. But now there was purpose. there was connection, there was dignity. And as the sun set once more over that forgotten city on the map, Bruce remained seated on the porch, silent, watching the world go on its course. A war veteran, yes, but also a man who proved that even the most underestimated lives carry stories capable of changing everything. Because in the end, it was never about laughter or judgment. It was about seeing the invisible and respecting the battles that no one sees. If you've made it this far, it's because this story has truly stayed with you until the end. Content like this exists to give voice to stories that usually go unnoticed. And that's exactly what this channel aims to do. If it makes sense for you to continue listening to narratives with this human weight, subscribing is simply a simple way to stay connected. If you want, leave a comment saying, "I'm with you until the end." That way I know this message reached where it needed to. And if at any point in this journey, you felt a connection with Bruce, a simple like already demonstrates that without needing to say much. There's a video over here that complements this story and delves even deeper into this topic. Click on it and continue the conversation with me there. It's not over yet.